Dear students, I welcome you to my class. I am Dr. Elham Hossain, Associate Professor of English, Dhaka City College. And our today's discussion will concentrate on the text, that is Culture and Imperialism. And in our last class, we had some introductory discussion. And I gave you some key terms, that is culture, imperialism, ethnography, margin, center, subaltern, discourse. So these are some of the terms that I mentioned in the last class. And I believe that you have been acquainted with these terms very well. And today I like to start the text. And while going to start the text, I think all of us should have some preparation on these particular terms. And these terms will help us as the keys. And with these keys, we will unlock the text. And these terms will also help us understand Edward Said and his text very well. And at first, I like to share the screen with you. And you find the cover page of this text, Culture and Imperialism. And the picture that you find on the cover page is very much thought-provoking, because you will find that some flags are floating above the heads of the people gathered under a shade. And those pictures show that the flags which are fluttering in the air belong to the colonial countries or the metropolis. And Edward Said has said that while we will discuss culture, inevitably we have to discuss imperialism. And these two terms are very closely related to each other. So the discussion of culture inevitably includes the discussion of imperialism. Now, if we put question, why is the discussion of imperialism essential side by side with culture? The answer to this question is that culture is a very powerful apparatus for the exercise of domination, for the exercise of hegemony. Actually, domination and hegemony, these two terms are different from each other. In hegemony, there is no space left for the colonized to speak or to participate in the authority introduced by the colonizers. So hegemony is an absolute exercise of power upon the natives. But if you think of domination or dominance, this term is different from hegemony regarding its connotation. Dominance is more political. Dominance is more diplomatic than hegemony. Dominance creates some space for dialogues between the natives and the colonizers. So dominance leaves some space for interaction, for communication between the colonizers and the natives. And dominance takes resort to some techniques or some means. And by gaining recognitions of the natives, by the gradual gaining or achieving acknowledgement of the natives, very gradually or slowly, it takes up the natives in its grip and impose its power upon the natives. Actually, this is the basic difference between dominance and hegemony. Hegemony does not leave any space for communication or for dialogues between the colonizers and the natives. So hegemony just exercises power upon the people. It imposes the culture of the colonizers upon the natives and brands the local culture as primitivism, and also declares that the natives do not have any history, they do not have any culture. So in that very vacuum, the colonizers penetrate their culture, their power structure, their belief system, and in this way, they enslave the people, they transform the people into other. This is hegemony. But dominance works in a different way. It lets the natives understand that the outsiders who have come to their country with their culture, with their language, with their belief system, are not malevolent for them. They are benevolent for them. Actually, this is the impression which is created in the atmosphere of dominance. And while the natives are convinced that the outsiders are not harmful for them, or the imported culture and language are beneficial for them, then they accept their power structure, they accept their authority. If you think of Indian colonial history or the colonial history of this subcontinent, then we find that the British colonizers exercised dominance here. They did not exercise hegemony here. So why? Because India had a well-established government system. India had a very rich culture. India had very rich languages. So it was very difficult for the European colonizers to drive away all these things and establish their imported culture, language, aesthetics in the place or in the space which is already preoccupied by our culture, our aesthetics. So for that reason, they became very much diplomatic. They introduced their religion, they introduced their education system, they introduced their cultural realities, they also introduced their food habit, and ultimately our people, a section of our people received their education system, their religion, their belief system. And in this way, we became colonized. Actually, this is said by Ranajit Guha in his famous book, Dominance Without Hegemony. It's a very famous book written by Ranajit Guha, a post-colonial uh, critic and historian. In that very book, Dominance Without Hegemony, Ranajit Guha has said that the British colonizers exercised dominance here in this subcontinent, not hegemony. But if you think of Africa, the British colonizers went there, the Portuguese colonizers also went there, the French went there, and they declared that the Africans did not have their language, the Africans did not have their culture, the Africans did not have their belief system. Actually, they branded the Africans as primitives or savages. And then they imposed their culture, their language, their education system, their religion upon the natives. And while imposing all these ingredients upon the natives, they took resort to the means of torturing or repressing the people or persecuting the people. That is, they took resort to persecution or persecutive mode of exercising power. So the term hegemony, refers to the exercise of power without leaving any space for the natives. The natives are not given any space for voicing their likings and dislikings or for saying anything about them. Rather, the colonizers impose their power upon the natives. They are not ready to accommodate or welcome anything, any idea, or any suggestions from the natives. This is hegemony. And in Orientalism, Edward Said has described that colonizing or imperializing does not always go with persecution or does not always go with killing the people with guns or torturing the people physically. Colonizing or imperializing process also goes with diplomacy, with culture, with language, and that is no less powerful than the physical process of imperializing or colonizing. And the ideas that Edward Said incorporated into his Orientalism are extended to some extent in this very book, that is Culture and Imperialism, which was published in 1993. And in my last class, I told you that this is a book of some essays. And Edward Said composed those essays on the basis of his lectures that he delivered in United States, Canada, and England between 1985 and 1986. So during this very period, Edward Said was invited by different institutions and universities of United States, Canada, and England. And there he delivered his speech on the ideas of imperialism, on the ideas of culture, on the ideas of hegemony, dominance. And ultimately, those lectures received the form of essays. And these essays have been incorporated into this book, that is Culture and Imperialism. So, Culture and Imperialism is a book of essays. Now, what is the content of this book? In this book, Edward Said has said that literature of the colonizers worked as a tool of exercising hegemony, exercising dominance upon the people of different colonies. For example, he concentrated on the novels of Rudyard Kipling. He has also discussed Robinson Crusoe, which was produced by Daniel Defoe. He has also concentrated on the poems of W.B. Yeats. He has also concentrated on the novels of Jane Eyre, of Victorian writers. And ultimately, he proved that these novels or these writings were used as a tool or as an apparatus in the hands of the colonizers. So, literature is not only a piece of art, literature is not only a piece of aesthetics, literature is also a tool of exercising power. Actually, this is the message that Edward Said has given in this book. So we can summarize the content of this text in a single sentence. If I ask you, what is the content of this text, Culture and Imperialism? Your answer will be, this Culture and Imperialism says that literature can be used as a tool of exercising power upon the colonized people. The colonizers used their guns, they used their swords, they also used their cannons, bombarded aeroplanes to exercise power upon the people. At the same time, they used their literature and art to exercise their power upon the conscience of the natives. If the mind can be enslaved, then the state or then the country can be enslaved. If I can rule your mind, then I can rule your activities. You believe it. If your mind can be ruled, then your activities can be controlled. And how can the colonizers rule the minds of the natives? They ruled the minds of the natives by their literature, by their epistemology, by their philosophy, by their history. They imposed all these things upon the people. The people took the taste of these things, and ultimately they consented that yes, those things could be welcomed by them. And while they welcome all those things, that is their epistemology, their knowledge, then they were mentally enslaved. And if a nation is mentally enslaved, if a nation is mentally chained, then it can be chained physically easily. Actually, that is the technique, or that is the deliberate policy adopted by the colonizers in different parts of the world. Actually, Said has diagnosed this very truth in this book, Culture and Imperialism. And Said has advised his readers to study imperialism side by side with culture. So while you are studying the culture of the British colonizers, you have to study their imperializing process, because culture was used by them as a tool or as an apparatus to exercise hegemony upon the people of different parts of the world, upon the people of different colonies of these European metropolitans. So I think you have got the content of this text. Now I like to recite the text for your sake. Actually, this is the introduction to the text, and you have only the introduction in your syllabus. You don't have the whole text in your syllabus. And I believe if you can read the introduction with rapt attention, and if you can explore different corners of the introduction, then you will have some clear ideas about Said's conception of culture and conception of imperialism. So let's start reading the text. Actually, I will read a few lines at first and then critically analyze it. And if you have your text, please open your text and follow. About 5 years after Orientalism was published in 1978, I began to gather together some ideas about the general relationship between culture and empire that had become clear to me while writing that book. So Said at the very outset has said that after the publication of Orientalism in 1978, he got some new ideas. After the publication of Orientalism, he got some new ideas about general relationship between culture and empire. Actually, these ideas visited him after the publication of Orientalism. That had become clear to me while writing that. So while writing Orientalism, Said had some ideas about culture and imperialism. And after the publication of that book, he could bring about these ideas in a very systematic form. And then he decided to write a new book. The first result was a series of lectures. So the ideas that came to him after the publication of Orientalism were exposed in his lectures that I gave at universities in the United States, Canada, and England in 1985 and 86. So the ideas of empire and culture that he gathered, that he formulated after the publication of Orientalism, were exposed in his lectures that he delivered in United States, Canada, and England during this particular span of time, that is between 1985 and 1986. These lectures form the core argument of the present one. So ultimately, these lectures took the shape of this present one, that is this book, Culture and Imperialism, which has occupied me steadily since that time. A substantial amount of scholarship in anthropology. Anthropology means the study of human beings, study of different communities, study of their culture. So if you study anthropology, you study the culture of a community of people. You study the history of a community of people. So anthropology is a very important subject that takes its readers to the culture, ideas, and belief system of a particular community. So Edward Said studied anthropology He studied history. He also studied different areas of epistemology. And that very study has developed arguments I put forward in Orientalism, which was limited to the Middle East. So here, Edward Said has mentioned the limitation or the scope of Orientalism. Orientalism was concentrated on Middle East, on the political realities of Middle East. Though this subcontinent belongs to the Orient, though our South Asia or South Asian countries also belong to the Orient, but Said, while writing Orientalism, concentrated on the Middle East only. That is the Arabian countries, Palestine, Saudi Arabia, and other countries of the Middle East. And what was the British or American policy there, and how the British and American army and their military power was exercising power upon the people there, and how they were taking a hand into the diplomacy of those countries there. All these things have been very elaborately highlighted or discussed in that very text. So Orientalism has become a narrative of the realities of the Middle East. And after its publication, Said thought that he had to elaborate, or he had to broaden the canvas of Orientalism. Orientalism means the ideas produced by the Western countries or Western metropolis about the Orient or Oriental countries. So Orientalism is a projection of not the Orient, but of the West or Occident. Okay, what the Western people think of us is called Orientalism. What we think of ourselves is not Orientalism, but what the Western people think of us, how do they estimate our culture, or how they look at our identity, our political realities. All these things have been accumulated into a discourse, and this very discourse is known as Orientalism. So Orientalism is the projection of the West. It is not a construction of the Orient. Remember this. So this very idea of Orientalism is also used as a tool or apparatus by the Western metropolis or colonial countries, for example, England, Portugal, France. These countries have developed an idea about the people, about the culture, language, and realities of the Orient. And these ideas have been formulated into a discourse. And this discourse is called Orientalism. So while writing this book, Orientalism, Said concentrated particularly on the Middle East. But after its publication, Said thought that he had to broaden the scope of the book. And that very idea has been implemented, or that very plan has been implemented in his book, The Culture and Imperialism. So at the very outset of the introduction, Edward Said has clarified the background or the stimulus behind the composition of this book, that is Culture and Imperialism. So I too have tried here to expand the arguments of the earlier book to describe a more general pattern of relationships between the modern metropolitan West, and its overseas territories. So Said has also clarified the purpose of writing this book. So what does he want to show in this book? Said has said that he wants to show the relationship between the metropolitan cities, for example, London, which was the center of colonial power of the British colonizers, then Paris, another metropolitan city, which was the nucleus of colonizing power, colonial power of the French colonizers, and then Portugal. So Said has decided to show the relationship between these metropolitan cities and the colonial or colonized countries or territories of the world. So he has said that, so I too have tried here to expand the arguments of the earlier book. Earlier book means Orientalism, to describe a more general pattern of relationships between the modern metropolitan West and its overseas territories. What are some of the non-Middle Eastern materials drawn on here? European writing on Africa, India, parts of the Far East, Australia, and the Caribbean. These Africanist and Indianist discourses, as some of them have been called, I see as part of the general European efforts to rule distant lands and peoples, and therefore as related to Orientalist descriptions of the Islamic world, as well as to Europe's special ways of representing the Caribbean islands, Ireland, and the Far East. So Edward Said has said here that European writings, for example, their novels, their poetry, their dramas, and their essays, their history also, these writings are not written in favor of the people of different colonies. In these writings, they have distorted our identity. They have distorted our history. They have misrepresented and mal-represented the people of the colonies. And in this way, they wanted to prove that the people living in the colonies do not have their history, their language, their culture. And if they want to be modernized, or if they want to be civilized, so-called civilized, then they will have to welcome the culture, language, and belief system of the colonizers. That was the purpose of their writing. So Edward Said has said that the purpose of European writings, suppose we are reciting European novels, we are reciting poems, we are also reciting dramas produced by our previous colonial masters. So should we read all these things innocently, or should we think that these texts are the repository of only art or aesthetics? No, Edward Said has invited us to read these texts very carefully. Edward Said has invited us to take these texts as tools of colonizing process. And for that reason, he has said here that what are some of the non-Middle Eastern materials drawn on here? European writing on Africa. Suppose if you think of Heart of Darkness, most probably you have gone through this text, Heart of Darkness. In Heart of Darkness, the image of the Africans that we find here, that we meet in that very text, is a distorted picture of the Africans. We find some African characters there, but these Africans do not speak. Marlowe speaks, Coates also speaks, but the Africans do not speak. Then should we think that the Africans do not have any language? Actually, this is not true. The Africans have their languages. But Joseph Conrad has showed that the Africans do not have any language. This is called misrepresentation of the Africans, or distortion of the identity of the Africans. Now, why is it done? Or why the Africans are distorted? The Africans are distorted. Their identity is distorted with a deliberate purpose of enslaving them, with a deliberate purpose of making them slaves to the Europeans. Actually, this is the purpose, and this purpose is exposed, or this purpose is advocated through this text. So this text is a colonial text which is propagating the ideas of the colonizers. It is a narrative of the colonizers which is misinterpreting the Africans, and which is also speaking in favor of the justification of colonial enterprises in Africa. Similarly, if you recite the text, suppose a passage to India, most probably you have gone through this text, a passage to India. In passage to India, we find that the Indians are depicted with all the clumsiness, all the oddities, all absurd behavioral traits. Suppose Dr. Ajiz there is depicted as a repository of impulse or emotion. Ajiz is very much sensitive. Ajiz is very much emotional, but not sensible. So isn't it a deliberate portrayal of the Indians? Yes, actually it has got a purpose. The purpose of exercising colonial power. The colonial texts want to say that Europeans have superior culture and the colonized people do not have their culture, they do not have their language, so they should receive the culture and language and belief system of the colonizers. With this very deliberate purpose, the colonial texts are produced. Or if you think of Australia, Edward Said has told us about the Australians. The Aboriginal people, or the Aborigines, are the natives of Australia, and their culture is nearly 50,000 years old. So they have a culture which is 50,000 years old. But the British colonizer, for example, Captain James Cook, went to Australia in the 15th century, and he declared that this land is the land of the British colonizers because no human beings live here. Actually, in his eyes, the Aborigines were not human beings, and the British colonizers are human beings there. So he imposed the British culture, British language, British government system upon the Aborigines. He does not care the age-old or millennium-old culture of the Aborigines. He misinterpreted their culture, distorted their culture, misrepresented their culture, only to impose the European culture upon them. So this is called colonial hegemony that I have told you at the beginning of my lecture. Then Said has said, what are striking in these discourses are the rhetorical figures one keeps encountering in their descriptions of the mysterious East, as well as the stereotypes about the African or Indian or Irish or Jamaican or Chinese mind. The notions about bringing civilization to primitive or barbaric peoples, the disturbingly familiar ideas about flogging or death or extended punishment being required when they misbehaved or became rebellious, because they mainly understood force or violence best. They were not like us, and for that reason deserved to be ruled. So they also produced some stereotypes. Stereotypes means some hard and fast rules, a format. They imposed that very format upon the natives of India, upon the natives of the people living in Caribbean islands, upon the natives of the people living in China or Ireland, and they define them as barbaric, they define them as uncivilized or primitive, and in this way they just justify that their culture is superior culture, they have their own civilization, they have their modernism. So if these people of these countries want to be modernized or civilized, they should receive the Western colonizers as their masters. So they will be the masters and the natives will be their servants. And they do not believe in relationship, they believe in submission and domination. Submission on the part of the natives and domination on the part of the colonizers. Actually, these are the stereotypes. With the help of these stereotypes, they branded the natives as uncivilized or barbaric people. And with the help of these stereotypes, they exercised their colonial hegemony upon the people. And while doing this job, their writings, especially their art and literature, worked as a very powerful apparatus. So while reading a novel produced by the colonizers, while reading a drama produced by the colonial countries, we have to, especially we who were once colonized and who are still neo-colonized, should read their text very carefully with a curious mind, with a conscious mind of recovering or restoring our identity. Actually, this is Said's message that has been incorporated into this text. Okay, so dear students, I think I should stop here, and in my next class I will continue my discussion, and I will also critically analyze the text, and I request you to read the text at home carefully, and if you have any question during my lecture, you will put your questions and I will try my best to answer to your questions. So thank you very much.